Welcome to week one of English 101, Rhetoric 1. This is our reading lecture for week one. So I'm going to talk just a bit about a short story called Hills Like White Elephants, which was written by Ernest Hemingway. And our reading summaries originally, so just ignore, I apologize. I already have a mistake here. Don't worry about the due date on those. We're doing our reading summaries through the website. So we're going to be doing those as a discussion board. So don't worry about that due date. Just ignore that. Obviously, that's from May, so that's not affecting us, but these will be due weekly. We'll have reading summaries each week. But I want to say just a little bit about Ernest Hemingway. He was born in 1899 and raised in Oak Park, so that's not too far away from our campus, a few 4 or 5 miles away. And a lot of people would say he was one of the most influential American writers of the 20th century, maybe even still in the 21st century. Lots of people, there was a documentary on PBS about him last year, and lots of famous writers, a lot of people talked about his habits, maybe it didn't like him personally, but his writing was still very highly thought of. He defined himself in contrast to the values of his quote-unquote Caucasian church-going family. So at that time, Oak Park was a pretty conservative place. And so he kind of defined himself in a lot of ways. People would say he was reacting against that for his whole life. Here's a picture of his family. I think that's him over here, and then over here, a little older, and probably in Paris. Hemingway, one of the things I wanted to say before we read this story, and I don't want to talk a lot about him, but I just wanted to mention him because we're reading a story of his to start off. We're going to start off with what I would call a canonical, meaning it's part of the canon, what we call the literary canon, which is all the usually old, dead white people, I'm sorry to say, mostly male. But that, we're starting off with that, but we are going to go away from that as we go throughout the semester. So you'll see we're going to have a diverse range of writers, people from different backgrounds. But we are starting off with Hemingway. And so I want to say a little bit about him, and I'll say a little bit about each writer as we go through the semester. Now, this is not a literature class, but we're using literature as a springboard to express our own ideas on certain things. But I want to say something about Hemingway's style. So one of the things that people often say about Ernest Hemingway is he has what's called an iceberg method. In other words, we see a little bit, just like an iceberg. Like if you see an iceberg out in the water, you're going to see a little bit, but the majority of it is actually below the surface of the water, so it will be invisible. Some people say Hemingway's style is like that. He writes in a very clear, very simple, very easy to read, but maybe there's something going on below the surface, something implied, something that maybe he doesn't say directly, but he's hoping the reader will kind of catch it anyway. And we'll talk about that with our first short story. So how do you read a short story? Well, that sounds, maybe like a dumb question. But no, I mean, obviously you read, but what are you looking for as you read a short story? And I think if you think about, as we go, again, not a literature class, but it'll help us understand these readings that we're going to use for each one of our essay assignments. And if you'll just ask yourself these 5 questions: what are the characters? What's the setting? What kind of language is being used? What's the point of view? Should be a question mark, another typo. And then what are the themes for the story that you might see that are maybe, for Hemingway, some of those things that maybe are a little more subtle and not really spelled out. Here's just a little bit. I wanted to just share a bit to get us started. This is very beginning of our story, and these are all, the stories will be posted in Blackboard, so you don't have to, I have a reading packet that I'm going to post little by little as we go through, and so this first story will be posted in Blackboard. Let me just read a bit of this and talk about it for a moment. The hills across the valley of the Ebro were long and white. On this side, there was no shade and no trees, and the station was between 2 lines of rails in the sun. Close against the side of the station, there was the warm shadow of the building, and a curtain made of strings of bamboo beads hung across the open door into the bar to keep out flies. The American and the girl. Here we get our first mention of our 2 main characters, and that is pretty much there. If you listen really carefully, he does use kind of a nickname for her at one point, but we don't really hear too much. We just hear it. So he's American, and then there's a girl. So that tells us something about our story, right away. We want to know who those characters are. The American and the girl with him sat at a table in the shade outside the building. It was very hot, and the express from Barcelona would come in 40 minutes. So express sounds like they're waiting for a train. The station here, Barcelona, we probably know is in Spain. He's an American, but he's in Spain. Is the girl with them from Spain? We don't know. It doesn't say. Or is she British? Is she French? We don't. It doesn't say. It just says the American and the girl. And we may not find that out. You'll have to read and see. But we know we're in Spain. We know we're at a train station, waiting for a train. It's hot, and we have these two characters, a man and a woman. What should we drink? The girl asked. She had taken off her hat and put it on the table. It's pretty hot, the man said. Let's drink beer. Dos cervezas, the man said into the curtain. Big ones? A woman asked from the doorway. Yes, two big ones. So again, that's it. That's our setup for our story. It's a short story. I want you to continue on and read it, but I just wanted to share a little bit to get us into asking these questions. What could be going on here? It's, as you can see, the writing is very straightforward. It's not flowery. Like some writing that we'll read a little later is maybe a little bit more flowery, but most of the writers I picked are pretty straightforward. So we have two characters, right? We just saw, we have the man and the girl, and they're at the train station. So that's one of the first things, whenever we read this semester, try to figure out, if you can, who's either speaking or who's being spoken about, our main characters, when we read fiction. Of course, you do kind of the same thing when you're reading nonfiction, because you're looking for the writer's information, a little bit about them, to know about them sometimes. All right, so where are we in the story? And again, we know we're at a train station, and that's where our story is taking place. And the whole story will pretty much, I'll give you a spoiler alert, they never get on the train. I mean, we don't get to that point. We just get a little snippet, a little sort of vignette of their story, a little bit of their life. Another thing to look at, and this is harder sometimes to see, but is the language simple or complex? And like I said, with Hemingway, I think it's pretty straightforward. It's not super complicated like some other writers that we could look at. Is it literal or figurative? In other words, people, this is one of my pet peeves, but I won't go into it too much, but people say literally a lot these days. Like, I literally flew over the building. Really? Because that would mean you actually flew, right? Literal means exactly as it happened. It's a concrete, it's a real thing that happened. Whereas figurative is symbolic. So really, when you say I flew over the building, maybe that means you were running really fast on the stairs or something, but you didn't literally fly. Unless, I mean, maybe you have superpowers, but I don't. But so when we say literally, sometimes it gets overused in our day-to-day conversations. I know I say that sometimes. My hair was literally on fire. Well, no, that would be dangerous, right? But literal or figurative. So I want you to look and try to decide as you're reading a story, is this really happening? Or is this just like a dream? Or is this a symbol or something that they're just implying? Or is it really literally they're waiting for a train? And I think in our story, yes, they're waiting for a train. It's not a symbol of something. It's not a figurative train. They're at a train station. Concrete or abstract. So again, sometimes the language concrete would be very, they're talking about the beer, they're talking about the heat. That's very concrete. It's physical. You can feel it. Some writing is very abstract. So these are things that you can kind of look at, like, abstract would be even with language like produce. That doesn't, when somebody says produce, I don't really get an image. Maybe. But when they say the Braeburn apple I had for breakfast, okay, it's a specific kind of apple, you had it for breakfast, much more concrete. So sometimes you could just say general and specific. These are things to look at, and because it's also important when you're doing your own writing to think about these things. Am I being concrete enough? Maybe I could be more specific. Instead of saying produce, maybe I could say fruit, or maybe I could even say Braeburn apple. And then finally, point of view. Point of view is always important to know who's telling the story. And we have 3 points of view, basically. One is called first person, which is using these keywords or pronouns like I, me. That means I'm telling the story. I went to the station. I sat down. I think in our story we're third person, where we have he, she, it, right? You can take a look at that. Second person is much less common in fiction, where you say you, but there are some stories that are written like that. So this is a point of view, something to look at. And then also the themes. Are there things maybe going on, like we mentioned the iceberg method with Hemingway, under the surface, about love, about family, about friendship, growing up, honesty, conflict, any of these major, kind of universal themes, things that most all people would have some experience with or some idea about. So in Blackboard, you should be able to find under the week 1 folder for the course content, our discussion board. And I'm going to ask you to post in the discussion board and specifically, on this story and responding to these questions. If you're having trouble getting started and somebody else was posted, feel free to comment on their post. And I'm kind of looking for 300 words total, like if, each week. So that means if you saw something that somebody else wrote, and you said, "Oh, I really like what he said about, et cetera, et cetera," or even asking a question, "What did you mean by that?" I mean, be nice, right? Not like, how dare you? Don't say that. But in the overall post, if you want to just post, "This is my thoughts on the story and answer these three questions," that's great. But if you have some other thoughts about the story, that's fine. I want to keep it kind of open, just like if we were having a conversation in class, how that might go. So the discussion board will be open. And again, you're aiming, I'm hoping everybody, especially by the end of the semester, will be consistently posting about 300 words each week. And like I said before, I think of this as kind of like drills, like we're learning. Um, we're practicing writing on a weekly basis, and we're practicing thinking about some of the readings. And hopefully you'll get some insight by looking at other people's posts. And I do this all the time when I've taken classes like this before, where it's like, "Oh, I didn't even think about that," whether it's a face-to-face discussion or an online discussion, where I think that's really something that gets at the heart of the matter, that I couldn't even think of that myself. So we hopefully this discussion will help you learn a lot from other people in the class, and sort of get to know each other a little bit too, since we're in an online format. But anyway, that's week one. Like I said, I'm going to try to keep the reading lectures and the writing and rhetoric lectures kind of brief. So I will stop there. Feel free, as always, with any questions to email me. Thanks.